Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
Assuming that you actually make these choices consciously and you deliberate and actually choose among various options, it sounds like you're either, blameworthy if things go wrong, if you do something bad, or you deserve praise if things go right, you do something good. But if you don't make choices like that, if you just kind of automatically respond to your surroundings and act accordingly, is somebody who commits murder or even a lesser crime to blame for that action if they don't actually get to choose another action.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 67, where the days slowly become colder, but the holidays come closer. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or if authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Greg Hickey about his book, The Friar's Lantern. Greg Hickey is a former international professional baseball player and current forensic scientist, endurance athlete, author, and screenwriter. His debut novel, Our Dried Voices, was a finalist for Forward Review's Indie Science Fiction Book of the Year Award. His latest novel, The Friar's Lantern, is a grown-up take on interactive fiction. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Lindsay. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. Very excited to be here today with Greg Hickey, author of The Friar's Lantern. Greg, how you doing?
I'm great, John. Thank you very much for having me. How are you doing?
Yeah. Oh, I'm great as well. Thanks for being on the show.
Definitely. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm enjoying myself. November is my birthday month, so, just trying to ride that wave as long as
happy
possible.
Birthday.
Thank you. And going to visit my family soon, which will be great. So yeah, it's going to be a good time.
Good.
But I want to talk about this book, The Friar's Lantern, because it was fascinating, and it's a choose your own adventure book, which I've never talked to someone that wrote a book in that format. So I like firsts. So that's you, and something that it's not really out there so much. There's not so many adult choose your own adventure books that I've seen. So anyway, just to kick things off, tell us about the book. Talk about the story and what you were trying to do.
Yeah, so like you said, The Friar's Lantern is a choose your own adventure. For readers who are not familiar with that style, it really kind of came to prominence when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and they were intended for a younger audience, so mostly children and young adults. And basically the premise was the reader would be the hero in the story. So the story was told in the second person, and as the reader went along, the story would say, okay, you, the reader, are traveling down this path. You can either go into the dark forest or you can go into the equally dark and spooky cave. And you would say, okay, I want to go into the forest. So the text would say, turn to page 9. You turn to page 9, the story would continue from there. You run into a monster or you're chased by a wolf. Which direction do you run, etc. There have been a few choosable path adventure novels written for adults, more than I realized when I first came up with this idea, but there are some out there, mine being one of them. In this story, the style is updated a little bit more for adults. And there are two main plot threads. In the first one, you agree to participate in a university research experiment. So you go into a laboratory, and there's a scientist there who says he's going to do an MRI scan of your brain, and he's going to try to use that scan to predict your decision a week in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So a week later, you're going to come back to the laboratory. The scientists will have read the data and tried to predict their decision. And this decision could potentially lead you to earn a lot of money, up to $1 million. In the second thread, which happens the day after the experiment or the day after the experiment begins, you're summoned to jury duty. So you're assigned to be a juror on this murder case where a university professor, different one than the scientist you encountered in the previous thread, but this university professor is accused of killing a man who he believes murdered his wife. And the second murder occurred a week after his wife's death. So you're asked to decide whether this professor is guilty of killing the man who he believes was his wife's murderer, and if guilty, is he guilty of homicide, or is he guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or just manslaughter?
Right. Yeah. So heavy stuff.
Yeah. So a lot of kind of bigger issues going on, but hopefully still an entertaining story that readers will get through and kind of puzzle through the various scenarios that the story presents.
Yeah, I think so. And so just to kind of kick things off, I'd like to talk a little about the creative process. And, I kind of went and looked up, and it looks like you really started your career off with this big science fiction book. So I'm just curious about how your path, how your writing ideas took you here. How did you decide to write this book about, issues of free will and our justice system and all that? And how did you decide to make it a choose your own adventure format?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came up with the ideas for actually both of my first two books over 10 years ago now, probably closer to 15 years ago.
Wow.
While I was in college, and they slowly built, and I started writing them after I graduated from college. In both cases, I think it was coming up with an idea and then sort of finding the format that fit the idea, right? So that was true of my dystopian novel, which was the first one. And for the Friar's Lantern, I thought it'd be kind of a cool idea to write a grown-up choose-your-own-adventure novel. I didn't realize at the time that there are probably several novels of that format out there already. But I just thought it'd be a kind of a neat idea to kind of play with this form and see what you could do with it for a little more adult audience. Shortly thereafter, I was in a philosophy class, and we were talking about this experiment called Newcomb's problem, which is the inspiration for the university research experiment in the Friar's Lantern. And the Friar's Lantern have kind of updated the technology to make the terms of Newcomb's problem a little bit more plausible, and kind of adapt it for a 21st century audience. But it was really an idea of kind of combining the style of the Choose Your Own Adventure novel with this idea for Newcomb's problem into a single story. And when I thought about writing a Choose Your Own Adventure novel, and one for adults and one that would use that style for a particular purpose, I realized that a Choose Your Own Adventure novel should be about choice. So in this case, the reader is making choices as he or she goes through the story, but you as the reader are also forced to kind of grapple with, the impact of your choices, the significance of choosing out one option versus another, and also decide whether or not when you think you're making a choice, whether it's you actually making a conscious decision or whether that outcome is sort of determined by your genetics, your upbringing, chemical reactions within your brain, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think you use that to great effect, as that comes up in many different ways throughout the stories. You force people to think about these things and to really stop, as opposed to kind of just barreling through it, which I definitely, grew up reading Choose Your Own Adventures as well. And that would kind of be the style. I'd be like, oh, wow, I just this is so I'm just going to do this. And then I'm doing this, and then I'm doing this. And oh no, I died. And then you flip back to the beginning and, you run through it. But you're sort of you almost demand out of the reader a little bit more thought and time, because it's kind of meta in the sense that you're telling them and presenting them with this information that, hey, there's more going on here whenever you stop to make a decision.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great observation. And I mean, I think that's natural for a more adult audience. You don't necessarily, adult audiences are not going to plow through every book they read the way an adolescent or a child would. So it's appropriate, I think, for people who have are looking for a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak, in terms of the story and the ideas it offers.
Yeah, yeah. So, how did you go about putting this all together? But so because you had multiple challenges here, not just to tell a story, but also to, chop it up into bits and have different directions. And so how did you map out exactly the different paths people could take? And, what was the hardest part of putting that all together?
So kind of in two stages. At one point, I literally drew out a map, started from the very beginning and said, okay, if you choose path A, here's a line to branch off to path A, and here's a line to branch off to path B. And then from
Hmm.
there, kind of this branching tree that started out really nice at the top of the paper and then quickly devolved into squiggly lines and curves and turning
Right.
back on itself by forcing things into the bottom corner of one page. But so it kind of got messy, but at least it helped me to see what the story would look like. And I could be like, okay, I need to work on this scene, and then that scene ends here. I need to work on these two scenes kind of in tandem, depending on what the reader chooses, and then so forth. Another big challenge was typing that stuff on a computer and then figuring out, okay, how am I going to read this as a story draft, get to
Hmm.
the right pages, and then figure out how to translate those page numbers into eventually the final published version. So if I were to say in my first draft, okay, if you want to choose path A, turn to page 5. If you want to choose path B, turn to page 10. Well, pages 5 and 10 wouldn't correspond to pages 5 and 10 in the final published book.
Right, right.
So what I ended up doing was coding each section with a 3-letter code. So instead of page 5, it would be page AAA, and instead of page 10, it would be page BBB, and so forth. And so I could easily, just find those in the Word document and say, okay, here's the new section. All right, and this goes to CCC and DDD, and find
Yeah.
CCC and so forth. So that helped out a lot. And then, once everything was ready for publication, I was able to go back and quickly kind of just insert all the page numbers and get everybody to the corresponding page.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And did you find any of this particularly difficult or tricky, or did it once you kind of put everything down, did it really flow out pretty naturally?
I think once I kind of got the hang of what I wanted to do, it did come a little bit naturally. Certainly, I think the page sections were a little bit of a challenge, and I think also reading the drafts proved to be a little bit of a challenge. So rereading my own drafts and making corrections,
Hmm.
because not only was it important to know what page I was on, but it also was important to know what paths I, as the reader, the person rereading my drafts, what paths I had already taken. So did I
Yeah.
previously choose path A versus path B, and so forth. So I ended up also kind of color coding each section. So path A was all blue, and then path B was all
Mm.
red, and as you move down path A, chose different paths that turned a different shade of blue, and vice
Yeah, yeah.
versa for path B. So yeah, that helped a lot. But yeah, it was still definitely a new challenge versus writing a straightforward dystopian novel like my first book, to kind of juggle all these plot lines at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. And yeah, to be honest, that actually happened to me I read the book a couple different ways. I first read through it choosing one choice all the way, which was of course to take the million only.
Yes,
And
congratulations.
so, yeah, thank you. That was my first instinct. But I went back, and tried to read through it again, and there's some different things that happened here or there. But yeah, definitely at one point I was like, wait, because which one am I on again? Like where am I again? So yeah, it can definitely, even as a reader as well. I'm sure there's some people that are you have to juggle a little bit, and it's a thinking book, and I think that's what I like about it is there are multiple levels to the book, and you can reread it and gain things from it every time.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation about there being multiple levels, and that was my goal, is to write sort of an entertaining story for smart readers.
Mm.
You make a good observation about kind of getting lost as to where you are in your choices. And on one hand, I think it helps that the Friar's Lantern is not a typical childhood choose your own adventure book where there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of choices. There's a lot more prose in between each choice, so there are fewer
Yeah.
choices. It's a little bit easier to keep track of. But I think also because of kind of the similarity of some of the paths in the Friar's Lantern, I think that structure hopefully will help readers sort of question the choices they have made in the past. So if you choose path A versus path B, you might end up going down similar paths. And if you were to go back and choose the other one, I think it pushes readers to think a little bit more, okay, what's different about this path? Why do I like one path better than the other? And where do I think this is going to take me?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it just like, for instance, there's a game of like 3 card Monte that people play, and they have to pick, one card versus the other. And yeah, I think it's interesting in that sense that like sometimes it seems like the choices you make maybe don't matter. Maybe you're going to barrel along, or maybe there's kind of an ancillary story, but the main story is much harder to change. And so it's sort of interesting to think through, because it made me reflect on, wow, okay, so we have to make a million choices every day. Which ones of those are actually consequential? Which ones of those actually mean anything and are actually going to change our paths versus, if I get a chai latte or an Earl Grey tea at Starbucks, like, that's a choice and I have to think about it, but maybe that's not actually going to impact much, but maybe it will. Maybe someone else next to me gets the same thing and we strike up a conversation and become friends and they offer me a job and, my whole life is turned around.
Sure, yeah.
So it totally made me think about that. It's like, to what extent really are our choices mattering in real life or not?
Right. And I think there are a lot of choices like that. We know what you choose to order at Starbucks, the color shirt you put on in the morning. And then there are other choices where, like, tomorrow I'm supposed to go to work. I could certainly not go to work and not call my boss, and that's an option, but I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm going to go to work tomorrow. So there are a lot of choices like that. Like when you're summoned to jury duty in the Friar's Lantern, you could decide not to go. But I think most people are going to be like, well, rather than being held in contempt of court, I'm just going to go to jury duty and hopefully I'll get out of it or whatever, unless you really want to be on a jury. So I think there's a lot of choices like that where you have an option, but you really know deep down that you're always going to choose one thing.
Yeah. And to get into the book a bit, so one of the first kind of things that really made me think here was the conversation that happens after the break on the kind of the first day. You're just hanging out, you're playing chess on your phone. So, and I play chess, I like chess, so I liked this discussion about it. It made me think about it. And after rereading it, there's also multiple discussions of it, interestingly. But so I just thought, this whole discussion of chess computers and what they're actually doing was quite fascinating in terms of probabilities and is it possible to win against them, and it's that this type of artificial intelligence. So I'm just curious to know what you think. Where did that discussion come from, and what is knowing that there is some type of intelligence or computer program out there that can make decisions better than us in that narrow area? What does that say about who we are?
Well, I think in the setting of the Friar's Lantern, at least, the computer chess scenes were kind of designed to make readers kind of look at the way they make decisions, the way they respond to inputs and choose the corresponding path. So to take a little more simple example, computer checkers has been solved, which means that there's a computer program for checkers that's set up, and this program knows every optimal move to play in every situation. So it would be impossible for a human or for any other computer playing checkers to beat this solved computer checkers program, because the checkers program knows that, okay, if you play move A, then I play move B. That's the best move. I can't do any better than that. If you play move C, then I play move D, and so forth. So the best anyone could do playing against this checker simulation is to just force a tie. Are there ties in checkers? I'm not even sure.
Actually, I don't know either.
There are ties in chess. You can have a stalemate
there sure
in chess.
Are.
But in any case, so the way that the checkers program works is that for every input, there's one output. Mm-hmm. So there's always one best move to play in every situation. And so the question is, well, one, does that scale up to chess, which is a much more complicated game than checkers? But there are chess programs now that are, I don't know if they solve chess, but they, for all intents and purposes, they are capable of beating any human, even the highest grandmaster. And then for humans, do we operate the same way as a checkers program or a chess program? Are we just following this sort of script where we get an input and then there's an automatic response that generates what our body or our brain chemistry thinks is the best output? Or is there some sort of human soul consciousness that's making decisions and actually processing information and choosing in the most literal sense between one of two options or multiple options?
Yeah. It's interesting. It actually made me think a little bit about a book I read. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's called Thinking Fast and Slow.
I
Do you
have
know
not
this
read that
book?
one. No.
Oh, I think you'd like it. It's by this guy Daniel Kahneman that does a lot of like behavioral economics, kind of or kind of just choice decision making. And his point is that there's kind of this like slow and fast part to the way we think, and we think that most of the what we're doing is the slow part, meaning that like we're carefully deliberating and considering, and someone like you're talking to me now, and then I'm responding to you after some thought and all that. And the fast stuff is like if you touch like boiling hot water, our hands jerk back or whatever, and we don't really think about it. And his point is that most of the time we think we're operating in this slower world where we have conscious control of what's happening, and the fast stuff is just like a reflex, and that's the doctor hits your knee, it pops up, whatever. But in reality, it's the reverse. It's that very little of what we do is actually this like slowly, carefully thought out stuff, and actually our unconscious and the kind of the other part of our mind is far more in control. And he does tons of experiments, and I don't know if you've seen the whole one, like judges that are hungrier give harsher
Oh yeah.
sentences, like that kind of thing, where it's like the stuff you think shouldn't really matter turns out mattering, even though even for the people who are supposed to be the best at being impartial and thoughtful and caring. So that's kind of where that started leading me to.
Right. And I mean, we can see that a lot of times when you have sort of a casual conversation with somebody. You go into work in the morning and you meet your coworker, and the conversation is very automatic and scripted. It's hi, how are you? Good, I'm fine. How are you? What did you do this weekend, et cetera. So like you can you'll have that same conversation every Monday morning, for the next several years. I mean, with slight variations, but it's a lot of the responses are kind of programmed into your brain.
Totally. And so to go back to Three Card Monte, there's this kind of scene, and you meet this kind of crazy lady outside of the building when you're done for the day, and she's hustling you a little bit maybe, but you have this conversation about kind of the nature of your choices in terms of professions, and she has this point that actors start as beautiful people and they're taught acting. And probably it's not true for everyone, but there
Sure,
a lot of actors are very good looking, and maybe they then want to learn how to act, and and they become great actors, and that's fine. But her point is that it's very hard to do it the other way around. You can't teach beauty. I mean, you can get plastic surgery maybe, but there's only so much that can be done. So it seemed to me after reading that, I was like, oh, okay. So it seems like the thought there was at least that people have really less choice than they think, meaning that to some degree your genes are dictating some of the paths that are open to you. And to what extent then should we be resigned to our fate, and how is the person in the story then take that information?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly probably some leeway there. You're not, as let's say an actor, you're not completely determined by your looks, but on the other hand, Steve Buscemi there's a reason he's really never been a leading man versus,
Right.
Matt Damon is a leading man and not really a character actor.
Right.
When I was in college, I played baseball in college. I played baseball overseas after I graduated from college, but I was never going to be a Major League Baseball player. I liked playing baseball. I worked hard at it. Could I have worked harder? Probably yes, but I don't think any amount of work would have made me a Major League Baseball player. But then again, you always hear about athletes who, make it to the pros or make it to college at the top of the college profession, and people will say, oh, he had so much talent, but only if he had applied himself better, if he could only practice harder, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it works both ways, but I think when we're talking specifically about, talent or innate abilities or innate characteristics, I think there is some that's genetic, obviously, your talent, your looks, et cetera. But then there's some part that is what you do with the traits you have. Now, one way to look at that is say, well, you choose what to do with the traits you have. You choose to work hard and maximize your talent. Another way to look at it is say, no, this sort of hard work, determination, that's all also genetic. So the top athletes, the Michael Jordans, not only were they blessed with great talent, but they were also blessed with an incredible work ethic. And, there was no way for Michael Jordan to not have been a great athlete because of the things that he was innately given.
I don't know, yeah, but that for me, that one at least definitely made me wonder a lot. It's like, wow, okay, so what can I achieve or accomplish, in terms of like what's been set there. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I think it's definitely great food for thought, and it's also
Yeah,
on one hand it's sort of liberating. It's like, okay, here's all the characteristics I have. I have an
yeah,
opportunity to sort of maximize those traits to a point. On the other hand, it can kind of be sort of feel defeating. Like, I can only go so far. Like, I'm only capable of so much, and maybe I'm not even capable as much as I hope to or aspire to become.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this goes back to, if this is the deeper, part of the book, I think is, the extent to which there is free will, and we need to deal with, wherever our beliefs land on that spectrum. How are we going to live life?
Right.
Regardless of how we feel, we still have to wake up every day and, go to work, whatever, just manage all this. So we have to come up with some sort of coping mechanism for, the realities of the world.
Right. Exactly.
And you have so many interesting choices in this book. I mean, one of the other ones that I thought was fascinating was, there's a moment where it's kind of a thief, and someone tries to step in and save the day, and then that person gets hurt, and the woman that's getting taken advantage of is injured. And so you literally, there's two people on the ground potentially dying, and you ask the reader, pick one. You say, okay, you go and you can, there's only, you're only one person. You can go over here and try and help this young man. You can go over here and try and help this older lady. It's not clear what's going to happen. If you pick one, you might lose the other. And so for me, I mean, this was literally one I just like stopped and thought about it. I was like, wow, okay, like this is a tough choice. What would I do in real life in this situation? Like knowing that whatever I did could lead to a bad outcome, but also if I stood around and did nothing, definitely bad things would happen. And so that was a really tough one for me. And yeah, I was just curious, how you thought people might deal with that. How should we, what kind of framework should we be using to make these types of difficult decisions? And if you imagined people doing so in any particular way.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a great observation. I'm really glad that it kind of stopped you and gave you a little bit of pause. Um, a lot of the choices that I put in there are sort of me playing devil's advocate. So you choose one
Mm-hmm.
thing, and then the next choice is kind of like, okay, so now if you think that, how would you choose in this situation? Choosing between in the scenario you're talking about, to save the life of a younger man or an older woman. Well, on one hand, it seems like the younger man is probably going to respond better to your life-saving efforts, to CPR in this case, versus the older woman who, might have a heart condition already, might be relatively frail and just not as resilient as the younger man. And then if you choose to save one or the other, do your actions sort of influence not only what you think might happen, but, sort of the underlying reality of their actual health conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you make a good point, though, that anything you do or don't do in that point is, at least on the surface level, a choice. So whether you choose to save one or the other, whether you don't do anything, doing nothing is still a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of incumbent on the reader to at least make an effort in one way or the other and think about the consequences of their decisions and try to choose according to some sort of standard.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like, you need to get through life, you have to develop some sort of, like a moral compass or a way that you see the world, because, life is about these decisions and these choices and how we're making them. And so you're going to run into these, and different people will have different modes of, whatever has gotten them to this point, and then that's affected their moral code in whatever way. So, I mean, it would actually be almost an interesting study to me to see how, to take 1,000 people and have them all go through the book and make these choices, and then see, who makes what choice versus, maybe like a personality test or something like that, to see what types of people would make certain choices here. So it's just, it's an interesting thought, but yeah.
And I don't know if there's a way to do this, and it's probably a little creepy, and I probably wouldn't want to do it, but I wonder if there's a way to sort of track if people reading an ebook, like which choice they end up clicking on.
Well, I can tell you that I know one way this is happening is, are you familiar with Netflix's Choose Your Own thing they did, the Bandersnatch?
I didn't watch it, but yeah, I remember hearing about it when it came out.
Yeah. So I'm not like the biggest horror guy. Like the world is scary enough,
right.
but I think this has almost made me think about, like, oh, maybe I should give it a shot. But so for people that don't know, it's a Black Mirror special movie where you can actually sit and make choices, kind of like a choose your own adventure throughout the film, and there's tons and tons. I mean, there's I don't know, like 50 different paths you can take, and tons of different film and footage and choices and things. It's this massive, massive thing. And one of the things I read about it was that Netflix is tracking this.
Oh, okay.
So Netflix knows every choice you make the entire time. And of course, they're going to do something with that information, right? I mean, they're not just going to. So this was a concern I think someone wrote about that I read, that was kind of like, oh, like if they do enough of these, they're going to start to build up some kind of behavioral profile on you. They're going to know what types of decisions. I mean, probably, of course, some people are just, clicking whatever just for fun, but some people maybe are actually thinking about this and making decisions that reflect their personality, who they are. And then Netflix can then take that and, sell that to people for advertising or whatever. So yeah, I think that idea, definitely someone's on top of already.
Yeah. I mean, obviously Netflix is, tracking all your decisions with just the movies you choose to watch and using that for advertising or to suggest your next movie. But it's interesting to think about, how they might be using your choices within a movie.
Yeah. But still, it's pretty interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'll give it a shot anyway, but just give like false answers just to mess with the system.
Throw them off the trail.
Yeah. You have a Turing test. One of the paths in the book leads to something called a Turing test. Maybe talk about what that is and why you felt that was interesting for the reader, and how people can use that to think about intelligence and free will.
Sure. So a Turing test is basically a way to determine whether or not a person talking to you is human or not. So whether they're a human or they're a machine. In this case, you are conversing with a person via like a text chat, and you're asked to determine whether or not the person you're talking to is human or not. So in terms of free will determinism, it kind of goes back to that chess player scenario that we were talking about earlier, where you'd think a machine would be sort of just following this script, and it has this program response to, if I say, do you like movies? It says, yes, I like these movies. What do you like? Or something like that. Some trying to sort of predict the most human response versus, a human actually has free will and can kind of go anywhere with their answers and can kind of have a little more, what we would think of as like an organic conversation where they're actually coming up with original responses.
Right.
So there's kind of that tie-in of, is this free choice or is this, a determined machine-like response? But then in the Friar's Lantern, the Turing test gets flipped. So you choose, okay, I think, the person I'm talking to is a computer, and then it kind of waits a second and says, oh, the person you're talking to thinks that you are a computer or a human. So it's kind of putting it back on you, are your responses human in terms of being organic or original, or are they machine-like in terms of being programmed and determined?
Right, which is fascinating to me, because then you get into this kind of back and forth game where it's like, if you think that you were maybe talking to a machine, how are you going to talk differently than if you think that you're talking to a person?
Right.
Because we interact with our machines, when when someone says, "Hey Alexa," and like I have a friend that's like, "Hey Alexa, shut up." That's the way that he turns his Alexa off.
Right.
And probably not very nice to a person, but
Right.
to the
Exactly.
machine, maybe it doesn't care until of course the Terminator robots come for us. But for now, yeah, it's just interesting to think about the differences in the way that we treat our technology.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the movie. I think it's called Her with Scarlett
Sure.
Johansson and
Yeah.
Joaquin Phoenix, where he's dealing with an Alexa type device, and he ends up falling in love with this, basically just a voice.
Right. Right. And then at the end, it's just she just runs off with there's nothing
Right.
there's no connection. Not to sorry to spoil the movie for anyone, but it does not go well for him.
Right.
But it's a fascinating film, so highly recommend it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't want to spoil too much of the book. I mean, obviously there's a trial. It wraps up. You have to make some choices about the money. I mean, that stuff is that stuff. If you're listening, go read and make your choices. But there's a line at the end I really liked. And it wasn't because I necessarily agreed, but I just thought it was interesting. Where you say we all have situations where we react without thinking, but that doesn't excuse our actions. And to me, that was pretty fascinating because I think generally we can agree that that's true. I mean, there's certainly many situations where things just happen, and a big part of the trial that you talk about in the book is making that decision. Is it manslaughter or homicide? Was it premeditated? Was it just a spur of the moment? What was going on in this man's head, and to the extent to which people should get punished for reacting without thinking. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just curious about that particular statement. How does that connect with the judicial system that you're talking about here and spend a great deal of the book on? And how should we think about justice in light of that statement?
Yeah, it's a great observation, quite great question, and it kind of goes back to something you touched on earlier when you were talking about choosing to save the life of the young man or the older woman. And you talked about you have to have this moral compass in order to make decisions, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of as kind of secondary step when we're talking about free will and determinism. The first problem is, how do you make choices? Do you actually deliberate and consciously select from among various options, or is your response just programmed and determined? But the second step is one of ethics and morality, and it says, assuming that you actually make these choices consciously and you deliberate and actually choose among various options, it sounds like you're either blameworthy if things go wrong, if you do something bad, or you deserve praise if things go right and you do something good. But if you don't make choices like that, if you just kind of automatically respond to your surroundings and act accordingly, um, you know, is somebody who commits murder or even a lesser crime to blame for that action if they don't actually get to choose another action? If their crime is just the response that's programmed by their genetics, by their brain chemistry, whatever.
Yeah.
So, we like to think that people are responsible for what they do, but responsibility kind of requires that you have free will, and that's the way we've thought about it for centuries. But as neuroscience makes advances and it kind of finds out a little bit more about the way our decisions are made, there have been people who have called that assumption into question. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and so in the trial, when I think it's another juror that makes that statement about we don't excuse people for their actions, even if they're kind of automatic responses. So, in terms of society, I don't think we do. We expect people to be responsible for their actions. The question is, whether we should hold them responsible, and if we say, well, maybe we should be a little bit more lenient here and not hold people responsible for everything, then as a judicial system, as a legal system, what steps do we take to kind of protect people from others who might be dangerous, or to hold people accountable for what they do, even if what they do is not something that they choose to do in the traditional sense?
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. I mean, to think about the extent to which the entire body of law as it stands is truly a deterrent, right? I mean, this is the general thought, to me it seems, is that the the sentence for murder is a long time in jail, or even in some places the death penalty,
Mm-hmm.
with the idea being that that will deter people from doing it because you don't want that to happen. But if there's less free will than we thought, then maybe that doesn't matter as much, right?
Right.
And that's which. So this starts to call into I mean, the reason I think it's interesting is it just starts to call into question a lot of the assumptions that our entire system of justice is based on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you make a good point about, punishments for crimes being sort of a deterrent. On one hand, we might call that into question, well, if someone's a psychopath, deterrence might not matter to them. But on the other hand, if someone is, not a psychopath, but maybe has some um, tendencies to, take advantage of people when it suits them, maybe then a punishment like the death penalty or a long term in prison would be a deterrent because it sort of it acts as a deterministic check on their baser impulses.
Yeah.
But I also think sentences for criminal actions work as sort of a vindictive punishment in some cases. Like as a society, we're the same people who had, people attending hangings and guillotine beheadings and stuff like that. Like there's still a part of us, even as we think that we've kind of grown beyond that public vindictiveness, there's still a part of us that I think kind of, likes to see people get what we think is coming to them. So to see someone being hanged or executed in some grisly manner, there's still a part of us that kind of thinks, well, they deserve that. I'm glad that they got, what was coming to them. And so another thing that the question of free will versus determinant pushes is, well, should we be punishing people in that way? It's one thing maybe to say like, okay, this person is a danger to society, whether it's because they choose to commit crimes or whether it's because they have some aberration in their brain that causes them to, not consider the consequences of their actions. In either case, that person is a danger to society and, probably would behoove society to protect themselves in some fashion by, putting that person in treatment or confining them in some way, but maybe not punishing them from sort of vindictive, retributive sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that I don't know too much, but my sense of the things I've read about justice systems outside the U.S. is that they are somewhat less punitive in that way, and this is, part of what's led the United States to have the largest. I think we currently have the largest incarcerated population on the planet, and other countries do go that other route where they're more willing to put people in treatment or find alternate ways to help those in need. So it certainly seems like there's many different options and many different ways of thinking about this, and you wonder the extent to which people will start to come around or feel like maybe our way wasn't necessarily the best if it's resulted just in sky high imprisonment rates and and problems in those prisons even.
Right. Yeah,
So,
that's a good point.
but that's possibly another podcast
Yeah, I
discussion.
mean,
Maybe.
hopefully, kind of a lot of stuff in the book is sort of a jumping off point for
Right,
further discussions that maybe not fit into the book as it's
Yeah,
currently
no,
written.
I think that's a great point. So yeah, to that end, I mean, we've talked about a lot today. Was there anything else? Any other ideas, concepts, thoughts you hoped people would get out of the book or walk away with or touch upon that we haven't gotten a chance to discuss yet?
No, I think you asked a lot of great questions. I guess I could just add the scenario of the original research experiment is one that I find completely fascinating. Like this is my favorite problem in philosophy. And I'm really glad I was kind of able to adapt it to this book and kind of be able to share it with a lot of readers. I remember when I first learned about this in college, went to baseball practice right after, and I was asking all my teammates, what would you do in this situation, and trying to do a little straw poll, and then I was playing devil's advocate with everybody and just really enjoying thinking about it. So hopefully readers will kind of have that same experience.
Cool. Yeah. What else are you up to? Are you working on anything else right now? What are you thinking writing wise?
Yeah, so I'm currently editing a novel right now that I hope will be done sometime next year. It's a fictional account of a story about a fictional mass shooting incident in Chicago, which is where I live. So it follows four main characters in the year leading up to the attack and kind of investigates how and why each of those characters might have been involved in the attack.
Ooh, okay. Wow, that sounds interesting.
So yeah, interesting and dark and hopefully, I mean, obviously topical in an unfortunate way, but yeah, so it's been a big project, enjoyable in a sense, and I'm pleased with how it's coming out, but definitely kind of a dark topic and one it's been a struggle.
Yeah, I'm sure, but an important one to explore.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, let's wrap it up. I like to do a little thunder round, getting to know you, and then we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Ooh, living in Chicago, there's so many great options to choose from in terms of restaurants and stuff. I think Mexican food is always a great standby for me, and there are a ton of great Mexican restaurants around. Nice. I had to chat. There's a little butcher shop in Chicago that my wife and I like to go to a lot when we're doing kind of a big grocery trip, and they sell duck legs that they've previously made duck confit with. So basically, that means the duck leg is cooked in its own fat. So it's duck leg cooked in its own fat, but basically you take it home and just warm it up in a skillet, and that's incredible. So you're like really crispy duck skin, really this rich fatty meat. So it's always one of our favorite dinners when we get a chance to make that.
There you go. Okay, where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Well, I mean, I really do like living in Chicago. That's obviously why I'm here. So it's hard to say someone else is my favorite place because why am I not living there? But I would have to say Cape Town, South Africa. So I was there as a study abroad student in college. After I graduated from college, I went back and played about 6 months of baseball there with a local team. It's really a great cosmopolitan city. People are really friendly. The food is wonderful. It's got a really fascinating history, obviously, in South Africa, with it being such a new country after apartheid. It's really a place I immediately felt at home at. And if my family and my friends weren't halfway across the world, it's a place I could really see myself living.
Yeah, I've been to Cape Town for a couple weeks, and I'll also add in wine if you like wine.
Yes, absolutely.
There's plenty of wine to do there as well. Cool. Well, okay, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
My initial instinct is to say something grand like, oh, I wish that all children had an equal opportunity to achieve what they wanted, which I think, would be great, or, all children had equal access to education or something like that. But I also, whenever I think about doing something like so sweeping and grand, I wonder about the potential side effects that I'm not seeing.
Yeah.
So for the purposes of a quick answer, I'll say when I was growing up, I grew up when Michael Jordan and the Bulls were kind of in their heyday, and I never went to see Michael Jordan play live. So if I had magic wand, I think I would just go back in time, or something where I could go to a Bulls game live and see Michael Jordan play live. Then after that, I would tackle the big global problems and try to figure out something I could do without screwing everything else up.
Fair. Yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles and managed to get into basketball kind of after Magic, but before Kobe and Shaq.
Okay.
So it was that like late 90s kind of dead period.
Right.
And I was just like, yeah, it would have been great if I had caught one or the other. As soon as I left to go to college is when Kobe and Shaq came around and they three-peated. So it's okay though. Cool. Well, this has been amazing. Greg Hickey, the book is The Friar's Lantern. In case you haven't figured it out, this one is, it's pretty fascinating. You get to make a lot of interesting choices and really think about, what you would do in any given situation. So a very different kind of book. Greg, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you very much, John, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.